What would you do if the only thing you had left in the world was one broken horse and a $1 when a fired cowboy and his aging Mustang buy an abandoned native cabin for just $1? Everyone expects the same ending: failure, collapse, another man disappearing into the desert dust. But the truth waiting inside that forgotten cabin is bigger, older, and far more life-changing than anything he's ever faced. Stay close, because what happens next doesn't just rebuild a home, it rewrites a life. Caleb Reed knew something was wrong at the moment he stepped out into the yard that morning. The air felt heavier than usual, the kind that hung low over the sandstone ranch whenever trouble was brewing. Horses shuffled in their pens, dust swirled in lazy spirals across the ground, and the sky stretched out in a pale brittle blue, too quiet, too still. After more than 10 years working under the old owners, Caleb had learned how to read a place the way other men read books. Today the ranch was telling him something he didn't want to hear. He saddled up the way he always did, tightening straps, checking hooves, murmuring a calm word to his old Mustang Dusty. He swept the yard, fixed the broken latch on the barn door, and hauled hay until sweat rolled down his back. Routine kept his hands busy, even when his mind refused to settle. Because deep down, he already knew. By the time Bryce Halden, the new owner, sent word for him, the sun was barely past the ridge. Reed Bryce said from behind a desk that didn't suit him, a polished thing placed awkwardly in an office, meant for work, not show. "Have a seat." Caleb didn't sit. He didn't need to. Bryce didn't waste time. "We're moving in a different direction. Faster crews, younger hands. You understand." Caleb stayed silent. Words wouldn't fix this, and begging would only cheapen the years he had given to this land. Bryce watched him, waiting for some kind of protest. When none came, he leaned back and folded his arms. "There's no more room for the old way of doing things," he said. "And that includes your horse." Caleb felt something inside him stiffen. "Dusty's mine." "He's slow," Bryce replied with a shrug. "Eats like he's still pulling carts. He's not useful here." Caleb stepped forward, his voice low. "He goes where I go." Bryce waved a hand, already bored with the conversation. "Fine. But you're both off the property by sundown." Just like that. 10 years reduced to a handful of indifferent words. Caleb walked out through the gates without looking back. The men he'd worked beside for years didn't meet his eyes. A few nodded out of habit, but most kept to their chores, as if he were already a ghost passing through a place he no longer belonged. Dusty followed close behind, the old Mustang's ears twitching at the shift in the air. Caleb rested a hand on his neck. "It's just you and me now," he murmured. Dusty nuzzled his shoulder, and for a moment, that was enough to keep Caleb moving. They traveled light because there wasn't much to bring. Caleb carried a worn backpack stuffed with 2 shirts, a patched jacket, a pocket knife, matches, and a rolled blanket, whose edges frayed worse each winter. His money pouch held what was left of his final pay, barely enough to last a week. Dusty carried the rest, a dented canteen, a tin pot, and a few scraps of food. Not much of a future, but better than staying where they weren't wanted. They drifted across the Four Corners region, Arizona, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, following red dirt roads and long stretches of empty land that swallowed noise whole. At night, they slept beneath skies so wide they felt unreal. Dusty kept close his body heat, a comfort against the creeping desert cold. Caleb divided whatever food he could buy, always giving Dusty the bigger share. The horse had carried him through storms and droughts and broken roads. The least Caleb could do was make sure he didn't go hungry. Some nights the wind rose, dragging sand across their bedroll like tiny knives. Other nights they found small hollows in the rock to shelter under, and Caleb would whisper into the dark just to hear his own voice. Tomorrow will be better, Dusty. Gotta be. Dusty would flick an ear as if agreeing. But the truth was harder. Caleb had no plan. Just miles. Red Mesa was little more than a cluster of buildings clinging to the edge of nowhere. A general store, a diner with 2 tables, and a courthouse the size of a tool shed. Caleb stopped for water and maybe directions to a ranch looking for help, but as he tied Dusty to a post outside the store, something on the bulletin board caught his eye. A paper hung crookedly, corners curled from wind and sun. Unclaimed property auction, Navajo region, abandoned cabin. Opening bid $1. Caleb blinked, then blinked again. $1 for a cabin. He stepped closer. The print was faded, almost unreadable. A set of coordinates pointed somewhere deep into the Shiprock region, isolated land, rough country. He read the flyer 3 times, thinking maybe he was missing something. But no, there it was. A roof, even a broken one, for a single $1. For the first time in weeks, something stirred inside him. Not hope, he didn't dare call it that. More like possibility. Inside the store, he laid the flyer on the counter. You know this place. The shopkeeper frowned. That cabin, folks don't go near it. Been empty longer than I've been alive. A woman stacking cans nearby added, It's cursed. My brother swears he heard voices in there one night. And lights. No fire should burn that color. Caleb rubbed his jaw. Still standing, barely, the shopkeeper muttered. Why you thinking of buying it? Caleb glanced toward Dusty waiting outside, tail swishing slowly. Maybe, he said. The shopkeeper shook his head, half amused. Good luck then. You'll need it. But Caleb wasn't looking for luck. He was looking for shelter. And even a cursed roof beat sleeping in the open once winter came. The auction room smelled of old wood and older paper. Only 4 people bothered to attend, all of them leaning against the back's wall like they'd been dragged there. Caleb stood apart, a hat in hand, Dusty tied outside drinking from a trough. The county clerk read through a list of tools, scrap equipment, and 2 acres of dried farmland no one wanted. Then he cleared his throat. Last item, abandoned Navajo cabin. Minimum bid $1. Do I hear $1 silence? The clerk shrugged. Anyone? Caleb lifted his hand. A couple of the men snorted, one even smiling at the absurdity of it, a jobless cowboy with a horse past its prime buying a ruin that no one dared claim. $1, Caleb said clearly. The clerk raised his gavel. Any other bids? More silence. Sold. The gavel struck with a dull thud. The sound felt final. A door closing, or maybe opening. Caleb breathed out slowly, unsure whether he just saved his life or made the worst mistake he'd ever commit. When the crowd dispersed, an elderly native man stepped forward. His gray hair hung in a long braid down his back, and his dark eyes seemed carved from the land itself. You are Caleb Reed? He asked. Yes, sir. The man handed him a folded deed. My name is Thomas Yazzie. I filed the original notice years ago. That cabin. He paused, studying Caleb as though weighing something unseen. It doesn't choose many people. If it chose you, be respectful and be careful. Caleb frowned. Careful of what? Thomas only shook his head. You'll understand when you get there. Before Caleb could ask more, the old man walked away, his footsteps silent on the dusty floorboards. Caleb stared down at the deed in his hand. His name was written at the bottom in uneven ink beside a seal of the county. A cabin, his cabin, for $1. The journey to the cabin took the rest of the day. Caleb followed a dirt road so faded it barely existed anymore. The land opened wide in all directions, rust-red mesas, desert scrub, long shadows stretching thin as the sun began to fall. Dusty trotted faithfully beside him, despite the growing chill. If you were Caleb, would you really take a chance on a cabin that costs only $1? And why was it priced so low? Was something hidden there all along? Tell us what you think. And don't forget to subscribe before we step into the most incredible part of the story. The cabin appeared just as the last sliver of sunlight smeared itself across the Navajo plains. At first, it looked like a shadow, just a dark bent outline against the red earth. But as Caleb and Dusty drew closer, that shadow took shape, rising out of the desert, like the tired bones of something once alive. What remained of the roof had collapsed inward, exposing ribs of old wooden beams that jutted out like broken bones. Half the structure seemed to lean away from itself, as if it had been bracing against the wind for far too long. The single front door hung crookedly, one hinge rusted through, so unstable that even a whisper of wind made it tap against the frame with a dull, eerie knock. Gaps split the walls everywhere, holes big enough for coyotes or strayed dogs to slip through without needing to lower their heads. Caleb stopped a few yards away, taking in the full truth of what his $1 had bought him. "This thing's one good gust away from falling flat," he muttered under his breath. Dusty snorted softly beside him, ears flicking back and forth as if assessing the structure with an equal lack of enthusiasm. Caleb breathed out and let the disappointment pass over him like the wind. "We've started from worse places, haven't we, buddy?" he said quietly, patting Dusty's neck. The horse leaned gently into the touch, and since neither of them had anywhere else to go, Caleb stepped toward the sagging door and pushed it open. The sound that greeted him was a long, tired groan metal, complaining after too many years of being forgotten. The hinge protested loudly, squealing like something waking from an unwelcome sleep. Caleb paused in the doorway, letting his eyes adjust. The inside of the cabin was dim, though faint light filtered in through holes in the roof. The place smelled of damp soil, old fire smoke, and something older. Still time settling into wood grain. Dust hung in the air, swirling through the beams of light like drifting spirits. Then he noticed the markings on the walls. Faded symbols painted long ago by hands that understood this land better than he ever would. A sunburst with flaring rays. A bird mid-flight. Vertical lines representing rainfall. And the faint outline of a handprint, small, delicate, pressed into the wood, as though someone had left a final goodbye. A fire pit sat in one corner, filled with long cold ash. Beside it, a piece of charred wood stuck upright, as if someone had extinguished the flame suddenly and never returned. The floor creaked under every step Caleb took, and several boards were missing entirely, leaving dark patches of dirt beneath, where small plants had begun to grow. He bent down and picked up a piece of burnt timber. It crumbled between his fingers, leaving soot on his skin. "Someone loved this place once," he whispered. "Feels wrong how empty it is now." Dusty nudged his shoulder from behind, blowing warm air against Caleb's neck. It was as if the horse didn't want him standing too still inside that silence. Caleb nodded. "Yeah. Let's get settled." The wind was already picking up when he stepped outside again. The temperature dropped fast after sunset in this part of the desert. He scanned the cabin for anything he could use and spotted a board that had fallen from the roof, still mostly intact. He dragged it toward the door and wedged it in place using rocks to brace it. The door didn't close perfectly, but at least it no longer swung freely. Inside, he scraped together dry leaves, brittle twigs, and a few longer branches he'd pulled from a half-dead juniper tree out front. He struck a match and coaxed the flame until it caught. The fire glowed weakly, fighting the drafts rushing through the holes in the walls, but eventually it settled into a flickering heartbeat of orange. Dusty circled once and lay close beside Caleb, his warm body blocking most of the wind that seeped under the doorway. Caleb pulled his coat tight, sat with his back against the wall, and listened to the night unfold around him. The cold pressed through the cabin like fingers feeling for weaknesses. The wind found every gap in the wood, sliding through the slats and making the fire dance erratically. Above them, the roof shifted and creaked, complaining in long, trembling notes. Caleb dozed off, only to jerk awake minutes later when a violent gust struck the cabin. Dusty lifted his head, muscles tensing, ears pricked. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered, though his own heartbeat was pounding hard. Another blast of wind battered the side of the cabin. The boards shuddered, letting out a series of sharp pops, wood bending, straining, almost giving in. "Just wind," he murmured, placing a hand on Dusty's neck to calm him and maybe to steady himself too. Just wind, or so I hope. But as the night went on, the cabin made more noise than seemed natural. At times it sounded like someone or something pushed against the outer walls. A dragging sound, a thump, a soft groan carried by the wind. This land has history, Caleb thought, pulling his coat tighter and forcing himself to lie back down. And this house remembers it. He slept in short, restless bursts. Every time he opened his eyes, Dusty was awake, standing guard, ears flicking its shapes, moving in the darkness beyond the thin walls. Not danger, not exactly. More like presence. The morning sun cast a faded gold light over the desert, warming the cracked earth, but doing little for the bone-deep chill inside Caleb's body. He stretched, wincing at the stiffness in his shoulders from sleeping on uneven floorboards. "All right," he said, brushing dust off his pants. "Time to see what we can save." He walked the perimeter of the cabin, assessing the damage. The structure looked even worse in daylight. The back wall leaned outward, barely supported by its remaining frame. Gaps big enough to put an arm through lined the sides. The roof had 3 major openings. The foundation, if one could even call it that, was nothing more than packed dirt. Still, Caleb wasn't the type to turn away from a hard job. He spent the morning gathering what scraps he could find, fallen planks that hadn't rotted completely through branches thick enough to serve as makeshift supports, flat stones he could wedge under unstable corners. He sorted them into piles, wood here, stone there, anything questionable tossed aside. Then he got to work. He pushed stones under the lowest beam on the leaning wall, forcing the structure upright an inch at a time. He used long branches as braces, driving them into the earth at angles before tying them with lengths of old rope he'd salvaged from the barn ruins behind the cabin. Each knot tightened the cabin's spine, each wedge of stone gave it another breath of life. "Hold together," he muttered. "Just hold together." For the roof, he climbed up carefully, testing each step before putting weight on it. He dragged the broken planks he'd collected and laid them across the open gaps, securing them with strips of cloth from his pack. It wasn't pretty, but it would block the worst of the wind. Hours passed. The sun rose and fell across the sky, turning the red earth into copper, then into rust. Sweat mixed with dust on Caleb's skin, drying into a gritty layer he didn't bother wiping away. By late afternoon, he stepped back to look at his work. The cabin didn't look good, far from it, but it looked steadier, a little less doomed, like a stubborn old mule deciding it wasn't ready to collapse just yet. Dusty flicked his tail and walked over, touching his muzzle to one of the new supports. Caleb chuckled. "Yeah, I know. It's not perfect. But it's something." That night the wind returned, but the cabin held better than before. The walls trembled, but didn't buckle. The roof groaned, but did not split open. Caleb allowed himself a small smile as he added wood to the fire. But Dusty stayed alert. He stood by the doorway, ears twitching at every shift of sand outside. Several times he snorted softly, stamping once, but never stepping away from his post. "What do you hear out there?" Caleb whispered. Dusty didn't answer, but the tension in his body spoke for him. The land felt watchful, as though the desert itself were studying the new occupants of the forgotten house. That sense of being observed stayed with Caleb as the days passed. When he was out gathering materials, he sometimes felt eyes on him. When he worked on the cabin, the wind seemed to whistle differently through the cracks, as if carrying messages he wasn't meant to understand. But no danger ever came. Only that awareness. Determined to make the place livable, he resumed cleaning. He pried up rotten boards, swept out piles of leaves and debris, and pushed everything broken or useless outside. Using dirt mixed with small stones, he packed the floor until it at least felt solid beneath their feet. He designated a corner for sleeping, laying down a thick layer of dried grass and cloth to insulate against the cold. Each evening ended the same wayfire. Crackling, Dusty resting with his legs folded under him, Caleb wiping sweat from his forehead as he studied the cabin in the dim light. It was still fragile, still battered. But for the first time, it was beginning to look like it wanted to stand. Caleb exhaled long and slow, letting his back sink against the patched wall. Just one more night, he told it. Let's get through one more night. Outside, the desert wind swept across the land, whispering through the stones. Inside the cabin, broken, stubborn, defiant, stayed upright. And slowly, night by night, so did Caleb Reed. The morning began wrapped in white. A thick fog lay across the ground, like a heavy blanket softening the edges of the desert, swallowing the bushes and low trees, turning the world around Caleb's cabin into something pale and dreamlike. He stepped outside expecting cold, but the air was colder still. Sharp, wet breath stealing. Even the rising sun, usually fierce and undeniable in this corner of the Navajo Nation, could not cut through the mist. Only a faint glow marked where it struggled behind the clouds. Dusty grazed quietly near the edge of the clearing, his old hooves sinking slightly into the damp soil. The Mustang chewed slowly, calmly, until his head suddenly lifted. His ears shot forward. His tail flicked once. He froze, staring toward the low stretch of scrub that led to the creek. Caleb stopped mid-step. "What is it, boy?" Dusty didn't move. A soft sound, faint, almost swallowed by fog, reached Caleb's ears. A groan, maybe, or an injured animal trying to drag a breath through pain. Caleb's spine tightened. That wasn't a coyote, nor a deer. It sounded human. He grabbed Dusty's reins and began walking toward the narrow path descending to the stream. With every step, the fog thickened around them, swirling at their legs, clinging to their coats. The sound came again, closer this time, weaker than before. A wet, choking whimper. Caleb's heartbeat quickened. He dropped the reins and ran. He pushed through the tall grass, the brittle stalks brushing against his jacket. He slipped down the last slope to the water's edge and skidded to a stop. There, half hidden among reeds, was a human form curled in on itself. At first, he couldn't tell if it was a woman or a girl. Mud streaked the clothing leaves and twigs tangled in the hair. The body shivered violently, as if the cold were trying to rip it apart. Caleb knelt, brushing debris away from the face. A young native woman stared up at him with glazed, fever-bright eyes. Her cheeks were pale beneath the flush of fever lips, tinted a worrying shade of blue. She tried to push herself backward, but her arms buckled beneath her. "Easy," Caleb murmured. "You're hurt." She gasped when he touched her shoulder, a reflex of pain and a panic. Her leg, twisted at an unnatural angle, told him more than she could speak. The swelling around her knee and calf was already severe. She fought to form words. Don't take me back." And then her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed against him unconscious. Caleb stared at her for a moment, at the fog curling around them like white smoke. She couldn't stay here. Not in this cold. Not in this condition. With careful movements, he lifted her, cradling her weight in his arms. She was lighter than he expected, too light for someone her age. "Hang on," he muttered. "We're getting you warm." He whistled sharply. Dusty trotted down the slope, concern plain in his dark eyes. Caleb eased the girl onto the horse's back and secured her with rope so she wouldn't fall. Dusty took the weight without complaint, standing steady until Caleb climbed beside them and took the reins. "Let's get her home," he said, and Dusty moved. Back at the cabin, Caleb burst inside, kicking the door closed behind him. The cold outside only sharpened the urgency inside the dim room. He laid the young woman near the fire pit and worked quickly, breaking apart his stack of wood and striking a match. Flames rose warm and bright, licking the air with hungry yellow tongues. He heated water in his tin pot and dipped a cloth, wiping sweat and dirt from her forehead. Her skin burned under his touch, her breath coming out in ragged, too shallow gasps. He peeled away the wet fabric clinging to her limbs, wrapping her in his own coat. Then he turned his attention to her leg. "Sorry," he whispered as he touched the swollen limb. She flinched, even in unconsciousness. Caleb steadied her knee and felt along the bone. Not a clean break, a nasty one. He looked around for anything that might serve as splints. 2 thin pieces of wood lay near the door, fallen from the ceiling days earlier. He stripped them with his knife, sized them carefully, then secured them to her leg with a torn strip of rope and part of his bedroll. When she stirred, trying to shove his hands away, he spoke gently. "I'm not here to hurt you. You're safe. I promise." Her eyes cracked open for a heartbeat, wild, frightened, lost, and then slid shut again. Caleb sat back on his heels, exhaling deeply. "You'll be all right," he said, not sure if he was reassuring her or himself. For hours he fed her tiny sips of warm water whenever she surfaced, murmuring to her, until she fell back into feverish sleep. Outside, Dusty paced near the door, ever watchful. Night arrived by the time the woman, who he now guessed was no older than 22 or 23, opened her eyes fully. She jerked upright so suddenly that Caleb nearly spilled the water he was holding. "Easy," he said, lifting his hands. "You're hurt. You're safe." She glanced around the cabin with suspicion, eyes darting from wall to wall, as though searching for exits or threats. When her gaze landed on Caleb, she stiffened. "Who are you? Where am I?" Caleb stayed several feet back, giving her space. "My name's Caleb Reed. I found you by the creek this morning. Brought you here to keep you warm." He nodded toward the fire. "You were freezing." She didn't seem convinced. Her eyes flicked next to Dusty, lying near the door. The Mustang met her gaze calmly, as if offering assurance Caleb could not. She relaxed a fraction, but only a fraction. "You didn't take me back," she whispered. "I didn't take you anywhere except here," he answered. "And no one's coming for you unless you ask them to." She studied him for a long moment, then turned away, pulling his coat tighter around herself. She didn't speak again, but she stayed. The next few days passed in a fragile rhythm. Caleb cleaned her wounds, helped her drink, fed her what little food he had. The fever receded slowly, like a tide that had to be coaxed out with patience and warm blankets. The swelling in her leg began to ease. She wasn't much for conversation at first. Every time Caleb approached, she watched him carefully, like someone who had been hunted before and expected it again. She slept lightly, waking at the slightest noise. But Dusty, who instinctively kept himself between her and the doorway, seemed to comfort her without effort. One morning, as the sun cast weak light across the cabin floor, she spoke unexpectedly. "My name is Nina," she said. Caleb paused mid-step. "Nina," he repeated. "Good to finally know what to call you." She didn't smile, but her shoulders loosened slightly. As the hours passed, words began to spill from her, not quickly, not freely, but piece by piece, like someone finally choosing to open a door they'd kept barricaded for years. "I came back here for something," she murmured one afternoon, staring into the fire. Caleb turned from the wall he had been reinforcing. "To this land," she nodded. "My family lived here, for generations." She traced a trembling finger along the earth-packed floor. "My father, my grandfather, their fathers before them, all of them connected to this land." Caleb listened quietly as she told him about the sudden deaths of her father and grandfather, both within months of each other. How the land was taken under the claim that there were no legal heirs. How the documents proving ownership had conveniently disappeared. "I came to find what they missed, or what someone hid," Nina whispered. "A journal, papers, anything that proves this land isn't abandoned." Her voice cracked. "But they didn't want me looking." Caleb's jaw tightened. Who men who say this land is useless, yet want to keep it anyway? She drew a shaky breath. "They followed me, cornered me near the old well, took my pack, my notebook, everything I'd collected." Her hand drifted unconsciously toward her injured leg. "Then one of them kicked me. Hard. Said I should leave the dead where they belong." She swallowed. "They left me there. They thought I wouldn't make it out." She lifted her chin, fire flickering in her dark eyes. "But I did." Caleb stood silent, staring at the young woman who had survived more than he had imagined. Then he gestured gently toward the wall. "You said your family lived here," he prompted. Nina nodded again, this time with certainty. She pointed toward one of the faded markings on the wooden paneling. "That handprint, my grandfather made it. And the sun symbol there." Her voice softened. "My father. He used to carve them into the wooden fences when I was little." Caleb traced the air above the markings, feeling suddenly like the cabin was more alive than he'd ever realized, bearing witness to lives it once sheltered. "This place wasn't abandoned," Nina whispered. "It was taken." When she finished, Caleb sat down beside the fire and stared into the flames. The weight of her story pressed against him. Then he looked at her, really looked at her. "You can stay here," he said simply. Nina blinked. "What, you're not going anywhere on that leg? And even if you could walk?" He exhaled slowly. "I'm not sending you back out there alone." She watched him with wide, uncertain eyes. People hadn't stood up for her in a long time, maybe ever. "This cabin didn't just choose me," Caleb said. "It chose you too. So, stay, heal, and no one will lay a hand on you. Not while I'm here." Nina's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She didn't speak, but the smallest nod passed between them, like the beginning of trust. Caleb cleared a corner of the cabin, laying blankets down, arranging food and water where she could reach. Dusty wandered over and sniffed Nina's hand gently. "For now," Caleb added, "this is home." Word spread faster than wind across the red desert. People passing along the distant trails saw smoke from the cabin's chimney, something they hadn't seen in years. Rumors drifted through trading posts and small nearby communities someone was living in. The cursed cabin again. Some came on foot to investigate, standing at the boundary lines carved by old property markers. They didn't step closer, just looked, whispered, watched. Twice a dark-colored truck drove slowly along the dirt road leading toward the land, then turned back before reaching the cabin. And once a man Caleb had never seen before stood by the wire fence, arms crossed, staring at the house as if calculating something. By the time Caleb stepped outside, the man was already walking toward his truck. He never waved, never spoke, just left. Caleb tightened Dusty's reins that night and slept with his knife close. Something was shifting in the land around them. And whatever was coming, he suspected it wasn't finished. Winter arrived before anyone was ready for it. By late November, the desert had turned from red and gold to bone white and brittle. Caleb woke one morning to find frost coating the inside of the cabin wall, a thin, crystalline layer that looked like spilled salt. His breath came out in slow clouds as he rose. The temperature had dropped far lower than it should have this early in the season. Even Dusty, usually patient with the cold, stamped his hooves and shook his mane as if trying to knock off the morning chill. Outside, snow drifted lazily from a sky the color of pewter. Thick clouds rolled in from the direction of Shiprock, the sacred mountain rising like the back of some sleeping titan. The clouds were dark, too dark. Caleb had spent enough winters in the Four Corners to know what that meant. A storm was coming, a real one. He stood outside the cabin, rubbing his hands together for warmth, watching the horizon swallow the light. Behind him, Nina pulled a blanket tighter around her shoulders as she stood in the doorway. "It comes earlier every year," she murmured. Caleb nodded. "Which means we have to work faster than every year." He surveyed the cabin. Despite all the repairs and makeshift supports he'd added, it was still fragile. Too fragile. A hard enough gust could peel the roof off like a lid. A heavy enough snowfall could collapse the entire structure onto them. He couldn't allow that. "Stay inside and keep the fire going," he told Nina. "Today we prepare for the worst." And so they did. Caleb spent the entire day reinforcing the cabin until his hands burned and his muscles trembled. He gathered every piece of wood he could find, fallen planks, broken branches, leftover beams from the collapsed side of the structure. Nothing was wasted. He drove a long stake into the frozen earth, leaning his full weight on it until it held firm. Then another, and another. The stakes supported the leaning walls like improvised ribs. He stuffed gaps with anything that could block the wind-torn cloth straw from an abandoned bedding sack, handfuls of wet clay he scooped near the creek. He layered the materials inside the wall crevices, pushing them deep until they formed crude insulation. The wind began picking up as afternoon turned to evening, rattling the roof with impatient fingers. Caleb, Nina called from inside. "You've done enough. You need to rest." He shook his head, hauling another brace toward the wall. "If the roof goes, all of this goes. We don't have the luxury of stopping." He tied a rope around one of the roof beams, pulling it tight until it stopped shifting. His palms tore open under the rope's friction, but he hardly noticed. He drove another nail into place, using a rock when the hammer slipped from his numb fingers. Nina stood behind him with a blanket wrapped around her, watching with a worried crease between her brows. "You don't have to prove anything," she said softly. Caleb let out a long breath. "I'm not proving anything. I'm surviving." He tightened the last knot. "We all are." Dusty worked beside them as best he could. Caleb looped a rope around a heavy support beam, and the old Mustang dug his hooves into the snow, pulling with slow determination. His breath puffed out in white bursts. His muscles trembled. Yet he didn't stop until the beam dropped into place. Nina rushed to him afterward, pressing her hands to his neck. "You're freezing," she whispered to the horse. Dusty leaned into her touch, exhaling weakly. "He's getting old," Caleb said quietly. "But he knows what we're doing matters." Dusty still walked the perimeter of the cabin each evening, as if guarding it, guarding them. He stood at the entrance during the darkest hours, ears tuned to every sound beyond the veil of snow. But even the strongest companions weaken with time. Nina spent every spare moment caring for him, rubbing warmth into his legs, applying herbs she ground into paste, feeding him sips of warm broth when he refused cold water. "Thank you," Caleb told her more than once. Nina just shook her head. "He's part of this home. I take care of what belongs to this land." Inside, she kept the fire alive, through every gust of wind that threatened to snuff it out. She cooked thin soup from the last potatoes Caleb had brought from town, stirring it slowly, letting the warmth fill the cramped cabin. When Caleb came in each evening, exhausted, streaked with dirt, shaking with cold, she pressed a hot bowl into his hands without a word. Dusty would rest near the door, while she wrapped his legs in cloth stripes for warmth. The cabin had become a fragile ecosystem of willpower, firelight, and shared endurance. None of them alone would have survived the cold. The storm arrived with no mercy. That night, the wind screamed across the plain, like something alive, something wild and ravenous. The entire cabin trembled. Snow hurled itself sideways against the walls, hissing through cracks as fine powder. Inside, the lantern flickered violently, shadows jumping across the cramped room. Dusty lay near the entrance, muscles tense, his ears pinned forward. Caleb crouched by the fire, feeding it steadily, watching the flames bend with each blast of cold air. Nina tried to sleep, but after an hour she sat up, wrapping her blanket tight. "I've never heard a storm like this," she whispered. Caleb didn't answer. He listened. The storm was loud, but amidst the roar, he heard something else. A sound that didn't fit. Knock. It was faint. A mistake, maybe. A branch hitting the wall, then it came again. Cock, cock, cock. 3 hard knocks. Determined. Human. Nina froze. No one could be out there. Not in this. Dusty rose onto shaky legs, pushing his nose toward the door. Another knock came this time, weaker, slipping into the howling wind like a dying breath. Caleb grabbed his knife and stepped carefully toward the entrance. He pressed a hand against the door, leaned in, listening for voices. Nothing. Just the storm. But Dusty nudged the wood, as if urging him onward. Caleb unlatched the brace, breathed once, and yanked the door open. A blast of cold hit him so hard it stole his breath. Snow swirled violently, stinging his face. Through the white blur, 3 figures staggered into view. A man, a woman clutching a bundled child, their bodies bent under the weight of wind and terror. The child's face, what little could be seen, was pale, motionless. The man gasped, "Help. Please. Our boy." Caleb pulled them inside, slammed the door shut, and braced it again. The storm screamed as if furious that prey had escaped its jaws. They laid the child, no older than 6, near the fire. His clothes were soaked, his lips nearly blue. He didn't react when Caleb touched his cheek. "He's freezing," Caleb said. "We have to move fast." The mother knelt beside her son, sobbing. He stopped. He just stopped moving. "Please." Caleb stripped the wet clothes from the small body and wrapped him in a thick blanket. Nina rushed to heat water, her hands shaking violently. Caleb rubbed the child's arms, legs, chest, trying to get circulation started. He held his own warm breath to the boy's face, letting the heat touch the cold skin. "Come on," Caleb whispered. "Fight." For long minutes, nothing happened. The fire crackled. The storm howled. The boy lay still. Nina held his hand, whispering his name over and over, voice trembling. 20 minutes passed. 30. Then, barely noticeable, the child's body jerked. Just once. A tiny gasp escaped him. Then another. A trembling breath returned to his chest. His eyes fluttered open for a split second. "He's coming back," Nina cried. The mother collapsed into tears, pulling her son close, but careful not to smother him. The father covered his face with both hands, shoulders shaking with relief. Caleb sat back on the floor, exhausted sweat cooling on his forehead despite the cold. He watched the revived child and whispered, "Good job, kid." The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, something changed. There was warmth. There was life. There was gratitude so thick it filled the cramped room like heat. Caleb rearranged the limited space so the family could sit close to the fire. He handed them what was left of his food supply, a half loaf of bread, the remainder of the soup, a handful of dried meat. Nina added another blanket onto the child, checking his temperature again and again. Dusty lay in front of the door, blocking the worst drafts from entering. The walls creaked. The roof complained. But they held. 6 people, 3 residents, 3 strangers huddled together in a small circle, their breaths forming a shared cloud of warmth in the dim light. Outside, the storm screamed without mercy. Inside, a single fire refused to die. By dawn, the storm had unclenched its icy fist. The world shone under the early sun, snow piled high, glittering eerily peaceful after a night of violence. Caleb pushed open the door, stepping thigh-deep into snow, squinting against the bright reflection. Behind him, the child, now alert and smiling, faintly peeked from his mother's arms. "You saved my boy," the father said, standing beside Caleb. His voice broke. "I don't know how to repay that." Caleb shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." The mother stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him in a trembling hug. "You saved all of us," she whispered. When the family finally departed, after Caleb helped dig out their vehicle and restart it, they left behind a small bundle on the floor. Dried corn cakes, a stack of firewood, and a handmade beaded bracelet. A token of thanks. A piece of their heritage. A promise they would not forget. Nina picked up the bracelet gently. Her voice was soft as she spoke. "You didn't just rebuild this cabin," she said. "You brought its spirit back." Caleb looked around the room. The patched walls, the strengthened beams, the lingering warmth of 6 survivors. He didn't say anything, because he knew she was right. Word traveled faster than the wind in the desert. It began with the family who had survived the storm. When they returned to their small Navajo community near Red Mesa, they spoke of the night as if telling a near miracle. Neighbors gathered close as the father recounted their desperate journey through the blizzard, the child going limp in his arms, the storm chasing them like a ghost, hungry for breath. But what they remembered most, and the part their voices softened for, was the cabin. That old abandoned place, the father said, shaking his head in wonder. "It saved us. And the cowboy living there, Caleb, I think his name was. He saved our boy." The mother added hand over her heart. There was warmth in that house. Real warmth. The story spread from ear to ear, from families to elders, from fire circles to trading posts. People spoke of the cabin that had once been dismissed as cursed, hollow, forsaken. The cabin no one dared approach for years. Now it had sheltered a family in the darkest night of winter. And someone new was living there, a cowboy who worked with bare hands and stubborn heart. Some of the older Navajo murmured, "Maybe the land hasn't finished its work." For the first time in a long time, people walked close to the property boundaries, not stepping onto the land, not yet, but standing at a respectful distance to look toward the silhouette of the cabin on the ridge. A place once abandoned had begun calling people back. The first offering arrived the next morning. Caleb opened the door and blinked, surprised. A neat bundle of dry firewood rested on the snow-dusted ground. No footprints except the ones leading away. He picked it up, glancing around the empty landscape. "That's strange," he murmured. Nina stood behind him, arms folded around herself for warmth. "Someone knows what the storm took from us." But the offerings didn't stop there. The next day, Caleb found a wrapped piece of fry bread and a small sheepskin jacket folded carefully on the step. Then, a tin lantern with a wick. Then, a pile of leftover lumber. Then, an old wooden toolbox filled with chisel's nails and a rusted but usable plane. Each time no one knocked, no one called out. These were quiet acts done the way people make offerings to something sacred, something returning. Nina watched Caleb's puzzled expression soften day by day. "They're not giving these things to you," she said gently. "They're giving them to the cabin, because it gave something back." Caleb looked at the doorway, the walls he'd patched, the roof he'd tied down, and he felt something rise in him he hadn't felt since long before he'd been fired. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. A few afternoons later, the sound of an engine broke the steady silence. Caleb stepped out, wiping sweat and sawdust from his forehead. Snow had melted just enough to create thin, muddy grooves beneath his boots. A rusty old pickup rolled to a stop. A tall man with graying beard and calloused hands climbed out. His gaze swept the cabin with a craftsman's eye, taking in angles, joint supports. "You must be Caleb," the man said, offering a hand. "Name's Ray. Heard this place stood through the storm. Wanted to see it for myself." Caleb shook his hand, unsure what to expect. "Well, it didn't fall down. That's something." Ray chuckled. "More than something in these parts." He walked the perimeter, running his fingers along patched boards, tapping on beams Caleb had reinforced with rope. When he reached the back corner, he crouched down and stared at Caleb's handiwork. "You did all this with scraps?" he asked. Caleb shrugged. "Didn't have anything else?" Ray straightened. "Not bad. Not bad at all." He walked back to his truck and opened the tailgate. Figured this might come in handy. He lifted out a wooden door, old, weathered, but solid. The panels held intricate Navajo geometric carvings, faded, but still beautiful. Alongside it were planks of pine, a small hammer, and a worn box of nails. "No one's using them anymore," Ray said. "This house deserves a proper door." Caleb stared at the gift, stunned. He'd never received something this valuable without having to work for it or pay for it with shame. "Why? Why bring this here?" he asked. Ray shrugged. "A house that keeps people alive deserves help staying alive itself." Nina stepped into the doorway, her eyes soft. "See, Caleb?" The cabin breathes again. Caleb swallowed the tightness in his chest. "Thank you," he whispered. Ray only nodded. Under Ray's guidance, Caleb rebuilt the entrance of the cabin. They spent hours measuring the doorway, cutting wood, smoothing edges. Caleb fitted the new door heavy and strong into place and tightened the hinges. It swung closed with a deep, reassuring thud that felt like a heartbeat, returning to a long, silent body. He built a small porch from discarded beams, shaping them until they held. He hammered stones around the base of the walls to block the worst of the wind. Guided by Nina, he mixed clay with straw, packing it into cracks like her ancestors had done for generations. Snow fell lightly as he worked, dusting his hair and shoulders. When he stepped back to survey the cabin, he could hardly believe what he saw. It didn't look abandoned anymore. It looked lived in, loved even. Ray stood with arms crossed, nodding in approval. "You're a natural, Caleb." "Good work." The compliment, simple as it was, landed deep. Caleb felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire inside. For the first time since he'd been fired, he felt capable again. Useful. Needed. The next morning, Caleb found 3 children waiting near the cabin. They were bundled in wool hats and thick coats, holding small tools, an old hammer, a short piece of wood, a frayed measuring tape. One of them, the oldest boy, stepped forward. "Our mom said, You might teach us, he asked, half shy, half hopeful. Teach you what Caleb asked, how to fix things, how to make a house stay up in the wind. Caleb hesitated, but the children stared up at him with such earnest curiosity he couldn't refuse. All right, he said. Let's start with choosing good wood. The children followed him around the pile of lumber, pointing, guessing, asking endless questions. Caleb showed them how to tell rotten wood from solid wood, how to swing a hammer without bending the nail, how to carve away damaged edges to make two pieces fit. Nina watched from the doorway, a smile tugging at her lips as the children crowded around Caleb, eager and clumsy and full of laughter. That afternoon, Caleb taught them how to build a fire pit safely and how to keep flames alive through the night, a skill worth more than gold during winter storms. When the sun dipped low, the children gathered their tools and promised to return. As they bounded down the snowy path, Caleb realized something remarkable. He was passing on knowledge. He was building more than a house. He was building community. Inside the cabin, Nina wrote. Page after page, filled with notes, drawings of old wall markings, memories from her grandfather's stories, sketches of the land before it had been taken. She wrote histories, songs, rituals, recipes, anything that tied her people to this soil. One evening she looked up from her notebook. Caleb was mending a broken shelf in the corner. This place has a name, she said. Tsehutsui Kea, land of the winding cliffs. Caleb paused. It's a good name. It was a gathering place, Nina continued. Births happened here, ceremonies. My family lived here for generations. Her eyes glistened with emotion. They tried to erase that, but they didn't succeed. She closed the notebook gently. You didn't just save me that day. You helped me reclaim something that wasn't supposed to be lost. Caleb didn't know what to say, so he simply nodded, feeling humbled. Winter's grip tightened, and Dusty could no longer hide his age. The Mustang's steps grew slower, his breath heavier. His once strong muscles trembled with effort when he rose in the mornings. Caleb spent hours tending to him, massaging stiff joints, feeding him warm mash, brushing snow from his mane. Yet every morning, without fail, Dusty stood at the cabin door, ears forward, watching the land as if guarding it. The children would pet him as they passed. He's the guardian horse, they said proudly. Caleb knelt beside Dusty one morning, pressing his forehead to the horse's. We're almost there, partner, he whispered. Just hang on. Dusty huffed softly, nudging Caleb's shoulder, an old gesture of reassurance. A promise that he would continue standing watch as long as he could. And as Caleb looked at him, at the tired but unwavering eyes of a horse who had followed him through loss and exile and storms, he felt a surge of gratitude so deep it nearly broke him. Dusty wasn't just a horse. He was the last piece of Caleb's old life, and the first loyal guardian of the new one. By the end of that week, the cabin had changed for everyone who saw it. It was no longer a ruin whispering of abandonment. It had become a refuge, a teacher, a keeper of history, a place where strangers brought offerings and children learned to build, a place where a young woman reclaimed her heritage, where an old Mustang stood guard, where a cowboy rebuilt himself piece by piece. The cabin once forgotten was part of the community again, alive, and waiting for what came next. The sun was sinking when Caleb placed the lantern in the window for the first time. The late afternoon light bled across the red cliffs, turning the sandstone ridges into sheets of burning copper. Caleb stood in the doorway of the cabin, holding the old Navajo lantern Nina had found among her family's belongings, a relic once used to guide travelers at night. Its metal frame was etched with swirling patterns, the shapes symbolizing wind dawn and the journey of returning spirits. He wiped the soot-stained glass, carefully polishing until the surface gleamed. When he trimmed the wick and lit it, the flame glowed deep, amber, steady, warm, unafraid of the growing dusk. Nina leaned against the doorframe, watching him. "It suits this place," she said softly. Caleb nodded. "If someone's lost out there, at least they'll see this light." He set the lantern onto the windowsill, positioning it so the flame could cut through the dark toward the winding hills. From that night on, the lantern never went out. No matter how harsh the wind, how cold the night, how heavy the snow, the returning flame burned. People noticed almost immediately. In Red Mesa, elders whispered of the sight, the long-dead cabin glowing again in the same way it had decades ago when herdsmen crossed the plateau at night and looked for the warm signal of home. Children spoke in hushed voices, pointing toward the hills. "If you get lost after sunset, follow the light. It will guide you back." And soon the cabin earned a new name, one spoken with a kind of reverence, the returning flame. The place once avoided now drew quiet visitors who stood at a respectful distance, feeling something ancient stirring there, something that had gone dormant for too long. Early one morning, as a soft gold light washed across the snow, Caleb saw 3 familiar figures approaching. The family he had sheltered during the storm. The boy, now pink-cheeked and full of energy, ran ahead with stumbling joy. "Caleb," he cried before barreling into him with an embrace. Caleb stiffened at first. He had never been a man used to affection. But then he returned the hug, placing one gentle hand on the boy's back. "You look stronger," he said. The boy grinned. "I am. And when I grow up, I want to build a shelter like this. I want to help people too, just like you." Something in Caleb's chest folded inward. He cleared his throat, unsure what to do with the warmth rising inside him. The father stepped forward and squeezed Caleb's shoulder. "You didn't just save him," he said quietly. "You gave us hope we thought we'd lost." Hope? Caleb hadn't felt that word in his bones for years. Not since long before Sandstone Ranch, before the day his life was stripped down to a horse, a pack, and a single dollar. Yet here he was being told he had given it back to someone else. The cabin looked different now, almost unrecognizable compared to the broken husk Caleb had bought. The new door Ray helped install stood firm, its carved geometric symbols catching light at sunrise. Caleb had reinforced the roof with fresh pine planks and tied them down with thick rope in a lattice strong enough to withstand winter winds. He'd built a modest porch as well, just big enough to shield visitors from rain or snow. Stones lined the foundation like a protective wall, packed tightly against drafts. Inside, the floor had been leveled and covered with wooden slats he had sanded smooth. A small table stood near the fire pit, along with shelves for food tools and blankets. It wasn't perfect, but it was safe, warm, alive. Ray came by occasionally to check on progress. Each time he walked the perimeter with quiet approval, nodding more than he spoke. "You built yourself a home," he said once. Caleb looked at the glowing walls, at the sturdy beams overhead. "I guess I did." Ray smiled. "Feels good, doesn't it?" Caleb didn't answer. He didn't need to. Dusty took to sleeping under the porch in the afternoon, soaking in the soft winter sun. His back had curved, his walk slowed, but his eyes, dark, gentle, steady, still held the same loyalty Caleb had known for more than a decade. Children who visited the cabin ran straight to him, stroking his mane, whispering secrets into his ears, as if he were a guardian spirit rather than an aging Mustang. "This is the protector horse," one child said proudly. "He keeps the returning flame safe." Caleb sat beside Dusty one evening, resting a hand on the horse's warm neck. "We've come a long way, partner," he murmured. "A long way." Dusty closed his eyes, leaning into the touch as if agreeing. Then one day a journalist arrived. A middle-aged man with a camera slung around his shoulder and a notebook tucked beneath his arm. He walked the property slowly, studying every corner, before greeting Caleb with a handshake. "I'm writing for the Shiprock Herald," he explained. "Heard stories about a cowboy who bought a haunted cabin for $1. Came to see for myself." He snapped photos of the rebuilt entrance, the lantern glowing in the window, the fire pit, where warmth always lingered, and finally of Caleb standing beside Dusty. "Mind if I ask?" the journalist said, pen ready. Why buy a house everyone else avoided, especially one about to fall over? Caleb considered the question. He could have answered with a joke, or shrugged it off. But he didn't. "Because it was all I could afford," he said simply. "And because maybe it needed someone to believe it could stand again." The journalist blinked, stunned by the honesty. He scribbled the answer down with quiet admiration. A week later, the article appeared, "The $1 Cowboy and the Light That Never Goes Out." People in nearby towns read it. Some drove out just to look at the cabin. Some left supplies by the door, blankets, food, candles. Some simply stood in silence, trying to understand how a forgotten place could come back to life. But Caleb didn't think of himself as a symbol or a story. He only thought of the lantern and the people who might need its glow. That evening, the sky turned shades of lavender and copper. The shadows of Shiprock stretched long across the plains. Caleb stepped onto the porch with the lantern in his hands, feeling the familiar weight of it. He lit the wick, adjusting it until the flame rose steady and golden. Then he placed it gently on the windowsill. The glowing light spilled across the wooden walls, up the beams, and through the cracks he had so painstakingly sealed. It illuminated the snow outside, making it sparkle as though touched by stardust. Behind him, Nina spoke softly. "You've made this place something to be proud of, Caleb." He turned the lantern flame in his palm, watching it dance. Then he said the words he had never meant to say aloud. "I came here with $1 and an old horse," he murmured. "But now, I have a light worth keeping alive. For anyone who needs it." Nina smiled, warmth filling her eyes. Behind them, Dusty snorted gently, as if adding his approval. The night deepened, the stars emerging one by one across the dark sky. But the area around the cabin remained bright, warmed by the golden glow that pulsed steadily from the window. It did not flicker. It did not dim. It stood strong against the cold. A beacon, a promise, a home. And as the returning flame shone across the desert, guiding the lost, comforting the weary, calling back the forgotten, Caleb understood something he had never expected. He had not simply rebuilt a cabin. He had rebuilt himself. And this time, he would not fall. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this story. If Caleb, Dusty, and the returning flame touched your heart, please leave a like, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next journey. See you in the next story.